Recording.
There you go.
Florida Forum updates with Kathy and Dee. Okay, let's get started. So before I go into the form changes that Florida Realtors has recently released, I wanted to go over just some key points of the NAR settlement that was the precursor to these forms being changed by Florida Realtors. So number one, settlement goals to secure liability relief for as many members, associations, and MLSs as possible, and to preserve consumer choices regarding real estate services and compensation. The key terms, liability release for NAR and over 1 million members, realtor associations, MLSs, and smaller brokerages. Compensation offers are moved off the MLS platform. Written agreements are required for MLS participants working with buyers. And there is a $418 million settlement payment that is over approximately 4 years, and NAR has denied wrongdoing. So those are key terms for us to know. Changes to compensation policy prohibits offers of compensation on the MLS. Compensation can still be negotiated off the MLS. Sellers can offer buyer concessions on the MLS. So the timeline, preliminary approval granted on April 24th. Practice changes are now effective August 17th. Final approval hearing scheduled for November, and we expect that to be approved. Rationale for settlement, reduce liability, of course, avoid prolonged litigation and uncertainty, provide a path forward for the industry. And there were exclusions. So some of the larger brokerages, such as Home Services of America and Redfin, are not included in the release of this liability. They've settled outside of court, outside of this. So also to note, final point here, no change in the NAR membership dues in 24 or 2025 due to that settlement payment of $418 million. Okay, so timeline of form releases for Florida. June 21st, these compensation agreements, there's 4 agreements that we're gonna go over today, these forms. Today, we're expecting the amended buyer broker agreement, the amended showing agreement, and the amended retainer agreement. I haven't seen if those are in form simplicity yet, to be honest. I haven't received any information on that yet. Have you, Dee? Dee, are you frozen? I think he's frozen. July 23rd, amended listing agreements are expected. And then, of course, everything goes into effect August 17th. Dee, I think you froze a little bit. Can you hear me?
Check.
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. Okay, I was just saying that I have not seen any of these forms being released today. I haven't seen that
not yet. Yeah.
Okay, so these dates could be a little fluid, but this is what the Florida Realtors attorneys gave us this timeline. So things are fluid, things are changing, just so you know. Now, these are the MLS rules that are effective August 17th. I just wanted to touch on these so we understand the premise behind all of these form changes. So number one, eliminate and prohibit any requirement of offers of compensation in the MLS between listing brokers or sellers to the buyer brokers or buyer reps. Yes, Robert, you have your hand raised?
Yes, so I've seen reports of sellers appealing the decision on the settlement.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
Is that going to have any impact on that date getting pushed back or?
No.
Yeah.
Lawsuits take an awfully long time, and appeals are about 5 years. So it's nothing that's immediate that happens.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And again, these things are, the forms could be changed somewhat, but everything is moving forward with the NAR in these changes. We're not going back. This is the new normal. So, okay, going back to our NAR MLS rules. So number 2, eliminate and prohibit MLS participants, subscribers, and sellers from making any offers of compensation in the MLS to buyer brokers. Number 3, require the MLS to eliminate all broker compensation fields and compensation information in the MLS. That's happening now. Stellar and all of the MLSs in Florida are doing this right now. and it will be done by August 17th. Number 4, require the MLS to not create or facilitate or support any non-MLS mechanism for participants, subscribers, or sellers to make offers of compensation to buyer brokers. Number 5, prohibit the use of MLS data or data feeds to directly or indirectly establish or maintain a platform of offers of compensation from multiple brokers or other buyer reps. Such use must result with the MLS terminating the participant's access to that IDX feed. Number 6, reinforce that MLS participants and subscribers must not, and MLSs must not, enable the ability to filter out or restrict MLS listings that are communicated to customers or clients based on the existence or level of compensation. Okay, you can't weed it out. Number 7, require compensation disclosures to sellers, as well as prospective sellers and buyers. Number 8, require MLS participants working with a buyer to enter into a written agreement with the buyer prior to touring a property. This is the big change right here, number 8. So I suggest taking a screenshot. Here's a list of resources. This has to do with the NAR settlement and also Florida Realtors, how Florida Realtors is doing all of this. Florida Realtors legal hotline. This number, keep this number handy, because this is something that you will always want if you have any questions for the legal team. Questions or suggestions, you can go to forms@floridarealtors.org. You know, these attorneys for Florida Realtors, they know the law. They may not know what it's like to be out in the field. So we are out in the field. We have that first, insight on how the forms are actually used. If you have suggestions. Oh, awesome, Ashla. Awesome. She says, I use them a lot. Wonderful, wonderful. So you may have suggestions already for the forms. Okay, so they've released new buyer rep forms. So they released 2 compensation agreements and 2 modification forms. The new forms aim to provide maximum flexibility to compensation arrangements in the transaction and are designed to allow participants in a real estate transactions to memorialize, that's a Florida Realtors attorney word, compensation arrangements. Memorialize meaning put it in writing so everyone knows what was agreed upon. These forms are now live in Form Simplicity. Okay, so we're going to go over seller's broker to buyer's broker, the compensation agreement. And then we'll go over the compensation agreement for seller to buyer's broker when the seller's unrepresented. And then there's 2 modifications. So if anything changes to those compensation agreements, you need to use that modification. Ashla, have you used all of these forms? These new forms?
I met that I use the legal hotline team.
Oh, that's great. I know. I love that legal hotline.
Yeah.
That is your right as a licensee. Okay. Oh, Sean, yes. You have your hand raised? Okay, Sean.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so my question, are these forms, is everything updated on through the Radius catalog as well, the Radius forms as well?
The checklist, yeah. The checklists are being updated as we speak, if not already done. Dee and I have been working on that with the compliance team for the last.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So the seller's broker to buyer's broker, okay? This compensation agreement is not between the seller and the buyer. It's between the seller's broker to the buyer's broker. So it has to be on the specific property. The term has to be defined and the compensation has to be defined. The buyer's broker must be able to prove procuring cause. That is a theme in this settlement. Everything I'm reading about the settlement is procuring cause is what lets you have earned and payable when the money is earned and payable to you. And going further with that, we're not talking about commission anymore. We're talking about compensation. So there's a terminology change that you should use with your clients as well. And also, essentially, clients. So when you're not working with customers anymore, you're working with your clients. You're working with a buyer who is in a fiduciary relationship with you. You're not just showing property to a prospect. So we have to change those things in our mind too. So yep, Radius is requiring this on all purchase checklists, even if the compensation is zero. So I'm going to show you the form right now, and we're going to explain what we mean by Radius requiring this form, even when compensation is zero to the buyer's broker from the seller's broker. Okay, here's the 2-pager. So we have here the seller's broker, buyer's broker. Those are the parties to this agreement. The property must be clear. It must be the full property. The buyer's name here, it says optional. It says optional, but we would like you to write the buyer's name here. The term, this is, if it's left blank, it's 30 days. I suggest putting in a little buffer, maybe 60 days, maybe 90 days. You want to put in a time frame here that's not just 30 days in case there's a little bit of delay.
Right, and the maximum amount of time anyway is 90 days for these documents.
Thank you, Dave. That's good. Okay. Buyer's broker compensation here. This is the key. Are you getting a flat fee? Are you getting a percentage of the gross purchase price? And you can even say plus some more of that or other. Is this something else? Other terms, you have to be specific, outline the other terms. Arbitration. By initialing in the space, seller's broker is agreeing that any unresolved dispute between the seller's broker and the buyer's broker will be submitted to binding arbitration by mutual agreeable arbitrator. Miscellaneous clauses here. And then the broker's commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. Those are in bold. So now seller's broker, buyer's broker, or authorized associate. So you're welcome to sign these on behalf of D&I. Or if you want us to sign them, we can sign them. Now, if the compensation from the seller's broker is zero, which you might see in the future, you need to put 0 on all of these and have that signed. We just want you to get used to using this form. And that's essentially why we want to see if it's 0. Do you have any questions about that before I move on?
So this form is to be used if the seller does agree to compensate the buyer, broker, or something.
If the seller's broker
Right.
agrees to compensate the buyer's broker, the next form is for an unrepresented seller.
Okay. So it's not in the MLS anymore, but if they are paying something, then this is the form that you use.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that this needs to be filled out with the offer that you're sending to the seller's broker. Have this signed right away.
Could we, could this form be filled out and uploaded to the documents section of the MLS, even if there's no mention or anything? And no? Okay.
No, because that's still considered in the MLS. So no,
Okay.
you can't put anything in the documents. You can't have a picture in the MLS because compensation for, compensation offered, like nothing weird like that. Where you can advertise it is like a yard sign rider, buyer's agent welcome. You can put it on a property flyer. You can put it on your, like a social graphic, you know, like on your Facebook or Instagram or something. You can put it on that. Yeah, you just can't get it in the MLS, and you also can't put it on any website that has an IDX feed.
Okay.
Okay, now this one, oh yeah. Questions? Or was that you, Dave? Okay. Compensation agreement, seller to buyer's broker. This is an unrepresented seller. So it's a defined term again. And here again, must be able to prove procuring cause. The procuring cause coming up again. And here is this agreement. It's very similar to the other form we just talked about, except the buyer's broker is here and the seller is here. Property address must be specific and full property address. It says listed by, and then seller's broker. I have a question for the team, maybe Dee. Why is the seller's broker on here? Oh, I said that yesterday when we were looking at this. Why is the seller's broker on here if it's seller? I think that's a typo.
Well, it might be just in case a seller decides to have a representative. I've had some cases where I've gotten an off-market opportunity and they say, yeah, we're willing to sell, but I already have an agent. So then the agent steps in and represents their side.
Kathy, why wouldn't we just use a commission agreement if it's an unrepresented seller?
Probably because this is part of the new structure, and they thought about every possible scenario.
This is part of the new structure, and great way to say that, Robert. A lot of what's happening is what we're familiar with has been adjusted.
You still have questions, Tony?
It just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, it's not something you put. It's not an MLS. So if you're going to have an let's say a for sale by owner that you're bringing a buyer to, it's not an MLS. Why couldn't you just do a commission agreement directly to them and make it a lot easier and simpler?
Because
you're not posting at an MLS.
They still have the option to have another agent represent them, whether it's on the MLS or not.
But I'm saying if he's unrepresented.
It's a really good question. I'm going to email that.
Yeah. So, Tony, let me make sure I understand the gravity of your question or your statement. Is you're saying if they're unrepresented, like a FSBO, we should be able to use the other form instead of this form. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Yeah. So I think part of the thinking is this. So one thing that Kathy mentioned is the fact of there is this full transparency process that happens now, which means that the seller needs to be aware of any compensation that is given to the buyer's representative. And I think that's what the sentiment of this form is overall, is so that full transparency happens. Robert brought up a great point, which is at any point a FSBO can get representation so that they feel represented. And as it kind of came down from NAR, and as the DOJ kind of scrutinized most of this process, they want to make sure that that transparency exists and that there are clear options. So just to give you guys a little bit more story to it, and you probably are already familiar, is that the DOJ is still investigating this entire process, right? They were given permission back in April to continue to pursue NAR. So it's really all about the compliance as it relates to the settlement, which is why this form even exists. So I know we're used to doing business as usual. Totally get your point, Tony. But I think this is that, I don't want to call it a workaround. This is that new standard, as Kathy said, for how we would proceed with this process. Because we want to make sure we get paid. So, I mean, I think that's what this has to do with, more specifically to make sure that compensation is defined and that you'll be able to receive compensation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I have a question, Dee. Then the difference between this form versus the first form is what's the main difference?
I'd have to see the two side by side.
I can answer.
Kathy. Yeah.
The main difference are the parties. So this one over here is the seller's broker.
For more information or
Ashla, can you mute?
I'm
Can you-
sorry.
Oh, it's okay. Sean, the first one is seller's broker to buyer's broker. And this one is seller to buyer's broker. If they don't have a broker. I think this
okay,
is a typo right here. Seller's broker. It's the same form, only the parties are different.
Okay.
The sellers have to sign this, and the buyer's broker, or
Okay.
associate. So you can sign as an authorized associate.
So one form is seller to buyer's broker, and the other form is
Seller's broker to buyer's broker.
seller's broker to buyer's broker. Okay, gotcha. Okay,
Broker to broker. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay.
So the reason we need these forms is because the MLS used to be this compensation agreement. It used to be the instrument to get you the money. Not anymore. It's not in there. So if it's not in writing, clear and agreed upon up front, you might be working for no money if you haven't already agreed to getting paid. So we have to have this signed.
So quick question, Kathy. If how soon, I know that there's been changes on how soon they go in effect. Are these, and I know you briefly went over that. I know there's a hard date in August, July 9th or 8th. When do we need to be having these forms in with each contract?
We would
Now-
like to see them right away.
Okay.
Yeah, because this is kind of the grace period before August 17th when it's mandatory.
Okay.
Let's get used to using them now. And I was saying, Sean, that even if the seller or the seller's broker is not paying the other broker at all, we still want to see this form that says 0 down here under compensation. We want to see that you are getting used to using the form and it's transparent.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so the two other forms that were released a few weeks ago was they are modifications to the compensation agreement. So say you say that you got under contract and the seller did not agree to anything. It was 0. Something happened during the transaction and now they're agreeing to give you 3%. Well, you need to get it in writing. Everybody needs to sign. You need to get it sent over to the title company. You use this form and you change the agreed upon compensation. Everybody signs. So there is a way to change it later. But again, it's very clear commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. In no event will broker's compensation exceed the amount of compensation in the written agreement with the buyer. So whatever you put on these compensation agreements between the seller's broker or the seller and the buyer's broker, it cannot exceed what you already agreed to with the buyer.
Can I give an example of that?
Please.
So if the buyer agreed to pay you 2% and the seller is offering you 3%, all you can collect is 2%. If that's what you've written on the buyer, if that's what you've agreed to with the buyer, is the 2%. That's all you can collect. So you want to be very clear as to when you're working with a seller's representative or a seller, if they're paying compensation or not. And you may, in some cases, want to have the discussion with your buyer well in advance of, because certainly you want to get the maximum amount that you can. But you know, if you and the buyer agree to 2%, that means that's all you can collect is the 2%.
Okay,
So in
I'm
other
glad
words,
you
always
mentioned that.
ask for the higher percentage.
Yeah, if you're meeting with your buyer and you say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is what I charge, it's 2%. The seller happens to be offering 3% because you signed the form in advance. All you can collect is the 2% that was offered to you by the buyer.
Or
Robert.
you're doing a vacation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so this is all about transparency, right?
Correct.
Yes.
So what if we are transparent and there's some type of clause that states, you know, we can earn a maximum of 3.5%, right?
No.
And then I forgot how I had worded it in an agreement recently. I'm gonna look it up and get back to you. But is there the potential of you getting paid from both sides if it is transparent? Like, let's say the buyer pays 2% and the seller pays 1.5%.
The only potential for that is if the buyer pays 1 and the seller pays 1. There is no you know, if you've set in stone with what you're going to receive from the buyer, that's it. There are no escalation clauses. There are no up to, or I'm sorry, I said escalation, I meant graduation. There are no graduation clauses. There is no up to, you know, or there's no standards of if sales price is this, then commission will be that. You know, there is no dual variable anymore. It is just, you know, either you're getting this percentage or this flat fee, but that's it.
Okay, so it's got to be specifically defined.
Yes.
Specifically defined, correct.
So if the seller, for instance, let's say we're representing a buyer and we put 3.5%, but we tell our buyer, hey, I'm going to try to get the seller to pay that, but here's you know, this is my fee. I'm going to try to get the seller to pay it. If the seller won't pay it, then I'll take whatever the seller will give, but I want the seller to see that the higher amount. And let's say the seller says, I'm only going to pay 3, or I'm only going to pay 2.5. You can't collect from both.
You can, in that case, because you've already established a 3.5% commission rate with your buyer, which means your buyer is now obligated to pay you either that 1 or 0.5%, whatever the deficit is.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
you would want the buyer to be at the higher percentage than if you're wanting the seller to contribute.
Well, always in negotiations, you know, you're going to start high, so and then come back down. Now, in that case, if the seller says, I'm only going to pay you 2.5%, do we have to go back and change our form to the 2.5% if we're not going to enforce that to the buyer?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Me
All
too.
right, so in other words, our agreement with the buyer is 3.5%. The seller's only going to pay 2.5%.
Uh-huh.
Do we need to amend our commission agreement if we're only going to accept the 2.5%? In other words, we're not going to charge the buyer the other percent.
Yes, you would want to readjust.
Okay. And can we do that? Because I mean, I don't know why we couldn't.
Yes, you can.
I don't know why if we were at 2% with the buyer or 2.5% with the buyer and the seller's paying 3%, I just go back and say, hey, I'm gonna amend my original agreement with you. Are you okay with that?
I do want to say this though, because again, everything has to be approved by the seller. There's transparency with the seller. And there is that possibility of a bait and switch, so to speak, which is you hype the seller up. Well, hey, my buyer was going to pay X and this is this. And you're paying 2.5, you know, and then you go back and now you let your buyer off the hook and the seller's solely responsible for the commission. After that change, you want to be really cautious on how that's done, because that has the potential for fraud in a sense. So you want to be really careful with that. You want to be really careful with that because again, you've already shown the seller that the buyer is willing to to pay your compensation at this rate. The seller's doing it in a statutory fashion, and then now you've made the seller solely liable because the seller, even during the point of compensation or during the point of transaction, can also say, no, I've decided not to compensate anything. Right. So you want to be really careful. This process is a little bit more tricky. That's why the DOJ still has eyeballs on everything because, again, unfortunately, we do have some bad actors in our business and we do have people who will try and quote unquote game the system. So I think a better practice might be to have just a very open and honest conversation with your buyer up front. This is what this looks like. This is why, I'm going to represent you solely, all that good stuff, have that language so that you're not having to make these radical modifications. And then the other use case for that would be if something happened with the buyer's lender that forces the buyer to be unable to compensate. That would be a good use case. But again, that would have to be disclosed to and approved by the seller. So if the seller says, well, I'm not going to be the one solely on the hook, then I'm only going to pay 1%, then you might be prepared for that. Or I'm just not going to pay compensation at all, right? It's movable at various stages throughout the transaction. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Okay.
Okay, Robert, you're next. You have a question?
Yeah, so marketing purposes. And this is more like, upon everybody's sole discretion, right? How they present themselves to the marketplace. So it used to be, hey, buyers, you pay nothing. The seller pays our commission. How would
that was one of the main tenets of the agreement, Robert? I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that was one of the biggest issues. That was one of the main tenets in the lawsuit itself, is because we gave buyers the illusion that there was no compensation that they were responsible for, when in fact that wasn't true. That was part of the whole reason for the lawsuit, is that language. So that language was disbanded even before the settlement happened. Was really never advisable to tell a buyer that, hey, it's free for you, right? And that language completely goes away.
Yeah. So my question was, how would we reframe it? And again, I understand that this is up to our own discretion. How would we reframe presenting value to the marketplace to attract buyers regardless of what we're charging?
That's a great question, Kathy. Can I take it?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, it's a big question.
When we talk about articulating value, and I can't tell you how to articulate value for you, but I can give you a very broad stroke of generalization, which is, what do you bring to the table? Right? Are you an expert in your hyper local markets? Are you aware of all the changes? Are you active in your community? All those good things that would suggest to a potential buyer that, oh my God, this is the person I want to use. Robert is the guy to go to because he knows about the schools and he knows, what's coming in next, and they're going to redo the park, and he's familiar with the business owners in this community and all those kinds of things. That's really kind of how we start the conversation of what my value is. It's not, I'm going to work hard for you. Of course you are, because that's your job, right? That's, a component of your job. But it really is all those little things. And if you keep in mind, real estate is always about lifestyle. It's never about the property per se. It's always about the lifestyle that you're introducing them to or that they want to be in. That's a great way to really kind of insinuate yourself into their lexicon so that they understand, oh my God, Robert is the guy who is just like me. He knows about these things that I'm into. That's kind of the best way, irrespective of, as you said, what compensation needs to be. I mean, you don't want to be the cheapest, because right now there are $200 lawyers and there are $2,000 lawyers. And so what's the difference between the two? Because both still do the same job. So it's really more stepping back, looking at your business plan, looking at what you actually bring to the table, and framing that into scripting language.
I
Does
love
that
it.
help?
Okay, great. And yeah, we definitely want to be the most expensive, that's for sure. That's ideal. But like, okay, so on our websites, if they have IDX feed, we cannot talk about any kind of compensation for any listings we're representing.
That's
But
correct.
can we talk about what we charge our buyers? Like, can I, you know, advertise on
Advertise
my
your
website
fee.
stating that I charge my buyers 3.5%?
On your website?
Yes.
Yes, you can do that on your website.
Okay.
So there's a page. You
Regardless
can
of
associate.
IDX feed, right?
Go ahead.
Even if I have an IDX feed on my website.
So that's what I was just about to say. You cannot associate your fee because that IDX comes from the MLS. So you cannot, next to each listing, I'm paying 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. That's one of those workarounds that, literally was thought of the day they said, let's settle this damn thing. So that's one of those clever, quote unquote, workarounds that Kathy and I have been to a ton of workshops, and this question comes up literally every time. It has to be more specifically like a separate page, services offered, cost associated with services offered. It's got to be that kind of a thing versus listing X. I'll pay out, this kind of thing. It's services offered and the cost associated with the services that you're providing. So a good suggestion might be, you may want to create, let's call it an a la carte menu style of a website. And then in that a la carte, for this service, I charge X, I charge X, I charge X, and then a bundle price maybe that says for all of the things, it's going to be this thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I have a menu of services pretty much.
Yes.
Yeah, menu of services. That way it's clear, it's transparent. The thing of it is for Kathy and I is we're just trying to definitely stay ahead of this and keep you guys out of trouble. We were talking about this yesterday, which is there's probably going to be a zero imposition of discipline for the first iteration. But keep in mind, MLSs are responsible for the oversight of this. So you may get one hand smack, but they do nothing. And the second one is definitely going to be severe because any violation of the terms of the agreement can cause the agreement, even once ratified, to be null. So that's what we want to make sure these things don't happen.
Yes, and I want to add something here that the top two tasks that a buyer's agent does, that buyers value the very most, help with negotiations and help with paperwork. Top two things. So I would include that for sure in your value proposition.
Oh, Kathy, you know what I just thought about when you said that? Our TXM product. So that's a value proposition for everybody in this room, which is you can do a transaction from start to finish, including property search in the app on your phone. So that's a value proposition right away. That's our TXM suite. So literally, it'll send out properties. As a matter of fact, it'll have the ability to brand your ID into that app to where you send out your buyer a link and they can search for properties. It says whatever you are, and continually reinforces and supports you. You can draft the offer smack dab in the app, all that good stuff. It pushes out forms. So that's value add all day long.
Yeah, absolutely, Dee. Okay, Ashley, you have your hand up too. You have a question?
Yes, my question is with the new listing agreements, like, I guess I'm confused because, typically whatever the compensation, I'm used to just setting whatever the compensation will be. And if there's no agent, other cooperating agent, then we have both sides. So would I have to just set the listing agreement percentage at a higher rate?
Well, the compensation on the listing agreement has been adjusted as well. And that's across the board in all states. So that compensation language we were used to seeing has been altered or adjusted to reflect what the settlement terms look like. So essentially, it gives the seller an option, basically. So you can charge this. So basically, the buyer representative compensation is unbundled from the listing agreement.
Right.
So you don't see it as this package now. You see what the seller is going to pay you, and then the seller has an option or an opportunity to contribute to the buyer representative compensation, but it's not an automatic like it used to be.
So if I end up attracting the buyer myself, I would have to have them fill out one of those forms and have them
Yes.
pay me something, or just be willing to accept whatever I negotiated for the list side only.
Yes and no. So I would never suggest working for free. So if you pick up a buyer, I mean, you're willing to work within the parameters, the constraints of what the buyer's affordability looks like, but it should never be a zero, right? The buyer's stepping up to the table, and it's part of the cost of doing business. And just to address something that Robert said earlier, which is free, realistically, all the money comes from the buyer, right? It compensates the seller, it compensates escrow, all the money belongs to the buyer. So the buyers never really work for free ever. It's just the price is created by the list side. And so that automatically includes technically what the buyer is willing to share for compensation for everybody, because it all comes from the buyer. Keep in mind, the seller's proceeds, the buyer's pocket are two different things, but the money comes from the buyer's pocket, even though the seller technically controls how the money's distributed. At least that's how it used to be.
That's the insane part about it. I'm flabbergasted by this whole ordeal.
Yeah, it's a big thing. And Ashley, I wanted to make sure. Sorry, Kathy. I wanted to make sure that I was hitting your question and your concern head on.
It sounds like you did. You said, it's not going to be bundled. Whatever I get on the list side is one thing, and if I attract a buyer, that I should be trying to negotiate something with them as well, and not work for free if I can.
Not work for free. And again, just as I mentioned, the conversation you want to have with your buyer, you want to have that conversation with the sellers. Guys, you got to keep in mind, sellers are just as confused as all of us as practitioners. We're not confused per se. We have an understanding, but this is all new to us as well. So that conversation you're going to have with your seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I know you may have heard these things, right? Because everybody on the planet has heard this. Most consumers think it's all about that we've been overcharging them for years. Sean, I saw you. Most consumers think we've been overcharging them for years, which was not the sentiment of the lawsuit whatsoever. But New York Times, the first day out of the gate after there was not a victory in the lawsuit, they said, National Association of Realtors agrees to slash commissions, right? That was the sentiment. So it's about educating your consumer, and as particularly your seller, if you're on the list side. I know you may have heard these things, but this is why I would suggest you continue to do this. And if we associate buyer representative compensation as more of a marketing fee, that's more palatable to the seller. Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, of course, based on their fiduciary relationship, they have to bring a buyer by. But the reality is my job is to get your home sold, not just to list your house. It may be advisable that you contribute something so that we can get the maximum amount of eyeballs on your property. Giving them some kind of language like that, that helps to educate your seller as well, because sellers are definitely confused. They're like, well, you said I don't have to pay anymore, right? And of course, if you can get it for less, but again, most often, the fees are baked into the price. That's usually kind of how it works. And so if you think about it, if you're pulling off that price, then the price is going to be less because it's adjusted by the lack of fee that's being paid out for the sale of the property. Sean, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Next.
D, you actually just crushed it with what the little role play you just went through, which answered part of my question. So
Cool.
that was excellent. Thank you.
No worries. Robert, another question for you.
Yeah, so you said something key there. You said you related us offering something to the or the seller offering something to the buyer's agent being equivalent to getting more eyes on the property. So my question to that is how, if we cannot make mention of it in the MLS, the only way I see fit to be able to do that is by verbally mentioning it to a potential buyer. So in what sense can we get more eyes on the property just because we're offering a buyer's agent compensation?
Well, I'm going to throw out this novel concept, and Kathy and I discussed this last week, is the fact this is old school, guys. You're going to get a hell of a lot more phone calls, right? You're going to have conversations with your peers. Because if you're the listing agent, if you're representing a seller, I guarantee you're going to have a lot of calls that are going to go, are you providing any buyer representative compensation? And then that's going to give you an opportunity. At least right now in the near term, that's going to be the only solution. Again, if MLSs are very sophisticated in terms of how they're viewing this whole thing, they're under a mandate, right? So they're going to be looking for folks who try and sneak in, any mention of compensation. So on the one thing, and I'm sure Kathy's going to talk about this, the one thing that you didn't mention, however, is concession. And Kathy already talked about the concession that can be offered by the seller in the MLS. In the concession, even though you're not going to directly head on, say, buyer compensation in that concession, you can say seller is offering or seller is providing concession to the buyer for 3% or whatever that is, which is safe. At least today. I can't tell you tomorrow, but today it's safe.
So okay, although we can't mention any type of compensation in the MLS, can we tell them to call to inquire about potential compensation, like giving them an instruction to
anything
out?
in the MLS description on it about it at all.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't say for compensation information, go to my website at www.robertkmurillo.com. You can't do any of that, as Kathy just said.
Got it.
Tony, do you have a question?
Hey, Tony.
Oh, hey, sorry. Someone spoke over you. This is just the way we've been doing commercial forever.
Forever.
Yeah, forever.
Right.
So
yeah.
it's not a big deal.
That's right.
And from the forms that you put up, it looks to me like the whole purpose of it, it's not the seller compensating the buyer, it's the broker compensating. If you look at the language, if you want to put one of those back up, if you look at that language, to me,
it's broker. It's broker to broker. Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seller broker to buyer broker. So
yeah,
to me, you could have that conversation, even though you're not going to be putting it in the listing agreement anymore, which I haven't seen that updated listing form yet. I don't think they've updated it.
The last update was in March.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. It still has I just did a new listing yesterday, so it still has the buyer's compensation on there.
It does.
Yeah. So to me, it's basically you're going to tell the seller, hey, it's a 6% or a 5%, whatever you feel comfortable doing, and even though you're not writing it down, you're going to say, don't worry, I'm going to compensate. I'm going to compensate the buyer, and that way you already have that there, so that you can negotiate, what you're paying.
And you're talking from the perspective of the seller's broker?
Yeah.
Well, the seller's broker is going to compensate the buyer's broker based on all the monies that came in from the sale.
Right. And that would, well, and I brought this up because we were talking, I think it was Robert that brought it up about, if you brought the buyer, then you have to renegotiate to yourself, which is kind of a hard thing to do with the seller saying, oh, I got to pay you more now because you brought me the buyer. They don't understand that relationship. So why would we even, to me, in my thought, I would just say, hey, it's a 5% listing or it's a 4.5% listing. That's what you're going to pay me. I'm going to negotiate and compensate from my side to the buyer's agent. You're not even involved, but that's what it's going to cost. It's not going to cost you more. I'm going to charge you a 5%.
I would go a step further just based on the sentiment of these terms in the agreement to say this is what I charge 4%. If there is any mention of compensation from the buyer's representative, I'll take care of that from this end, right? That way because what you described, at least as I heard it, is business as usual, right? Because that's what we always do. We always, hey, it's going to be 6%. I'm choosing how I'm going to compensate the buyer's representative. You want to make sure that that the seller clearly understands this is all they're responsible for, not that you're automatically enjoining the seller to pay compensation to the buyer representative, because I think that would get your hand smacked, as I heard it.
Okay.
Yeah. So you want to be careful how you tread, and over time you're going to find a balance on how the language needs to be, right? I mean, what you described is a great scenario. It's just going to be that balance of what's actually said, because the seller could come back and say, well, I was working with Tony and Tony told me he was going to do this so he could compensate the buyer, right? That's not going to be a good look. So it's draw your line in the sand as to what you think your compensation should look like for your side only. If it's 4%, great. Take that 4%. If you personally feel like you want to share that out to a buyer's representative, great. Keep in mind, you're going to have to then disclose that. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I charged you 4%. I wanted to get all the eyeballs on your property, so I've agreed to share what you're compensating me with a buyer's representative. And this is the amount I'm going to share. I know it sounds ass backwards completely, but this is just kind of how it looks and feels for right now. Just because we don't want it to feel like we're still charging the buyer for the seller for buyer representative compensation.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay, again, what we just talked about, the modification to compensation agreements from seller's broker to buyer's broker and seller to buyer's broker, I just put them up here. It's very simple. The form is very simple. You would use this just to change the term, either an extension to the term or the compensation is changed. Flat fee or percentage of the gross, or if there's plus any sort of flat fee, and then there's options for other, and then you explain the other terms here. So these are just modifications to the compensation agreements that we just talked about.
Okay.
Okay, and I do see that there are some new forms that were just added to Form Simplicity. So we will plan another room for that to talk about those. And those are revised buyer agency agreements.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're kind of trickling them out in July, these form changes.
Yeah, I think GTAR has a recorded video on what's going on.
Oh, yes, I'm all about the association videos and the workshops and classes. I'm all about it. I highly recommend you do that just to get your head wrapped around all the changes. Sean, Sean, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick question. With the forms again, are we still, I know I've been going through Sky Slope Is that still the best? I know it's still form simplicity, but is going through SkySlope the best to be getting these forms done?
Yes. I mean, either is fine. But again, as Kathy was saying earlier, we work with compliance and the transaction team to make sure they have the latest and greatest. Because you got to figure your transaction is coming in through SkySlope so you can get paid, right? So you can make sure your file's compliant. Eventually, again, in favor of the app, SkySlope is eventually going to sunset, right? We really want to start to push you guys towards the app once it's launched, because it's just such an easy thing. I mean, you guys are on the go all the time. So, to be able to do it inside of your mobile device and, get it done completely is a brilliant move.
It's the Radius Office app. So it's already available. The app's already available. You can download it from your app store.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, this has been recorded, so we're going to share this out after the room ends, and also it'll be on our YouTube channel. Let us know. You can email broker@radiusagent.com. Either Dee or I can answer questions for you that you have about these new forms and new processes. So thank you so much for coming and for participating in our room today, and have a great week.
Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.